Hello, my name is Stacy Moore, and I would like to discuss the issue of subnational violence at the Sudan and South Sudan border. Subnational violence is a problem that threatens to destabilize the tenuous peace that was created between Sudan and South Sudan at the conclusions of talks hosted by the AU. The two nations had hostilities between one another earlier this year over oil revenue sharing and transit fees for South Sudan to push oil through the pipelines in Sudan to the Red Sea for export. Now that that's been settled, it seems as if state-to-state hostilities are increasingly unlikely, as the international community has absolutely stepped up to help prevent such violence. But the issues surrounding subnational violence were not addressed in the Comprehensive Peace Agreement, which led to the separation of the two countries, or the most recent talks. And at this point, it is likely that oil will continue to fuel violence in the region, and that Sudan and South Sudan could use these subnational tensions to reignite hostilities between them. That's why it's so important that the international community address these issues before these festering differences erupt into state-to-state violence and cause even more hardship for the populations at risk there. There are several issues surrounding the subnational violence. One of the main ones is that there's a proliferation of small arms and RPGs in the area from the conflicts in the region, including the state-to-state hostilities mentioned earlier. Additionally, there are separatist groups that were not integrated into the political process during the Comprehensive Peace Agreement. There are international terrorist groups and regional groups such as the Lord's Resistance Army and Al-Qaeda, and also intertribal violence, because tribes have lived in that area throughout history, and now that there's an international border, they face growing limits on their ability to get to resources that they habitually have used, such as pasture land and water. These resources are also threatened by the extractive industries as they continue to search for additional oil resources at the border. There are several major international players in Sudan and South Sudan right now. The United States is one of them, as well as India and China. India and China are primarily interested in the energy resources that can be found in Sudan and South Sudan. The United States has taken a policy stand towards military non-intervention in Sudan and South Sudan. They've done a lot to encourage economic sanctions against the Bashir regime and have provided security force training to South Sudan and other countries in the region to help stabilize Africa through AFRICOM's many initiatives in security force assistance and strategic projection training for African nations. The United States also provides aid for infrastructure development and has provided money to the World Food Program to assist in emergency needs in Sudan. The United States does support South Sudan as a new democracy and seeks to increase its influence in the region by aligning more closely with South Sudan to limit the Islamist influence of the Bashir regime. China and India are also major influences because they're so heavily involved in the energy sector in Sudan and South Sudan. China and India both have a non-interventionist stance when it comes to military action in other countries. However, they do have divergent influences on subnational violence in both nations. China uses very exploitative practices when entering new markets for energy resources. And it's the same in Sudan and South Sudan as it has been in other parts of the world. They are not pushing money towards greater development or to other sectors of the economy besides the extractive industry, which allows revenues from those sources to be consolidated with a small elite and not used for the entire population's benefit. India has undertaken a more holistic approach to their interaction with African nations, particularly South Sudan and Sudan, in creating greater ties between their non-extractive industries and industries in Africa, including the telecommunications and electric distribution networks there. India is heavily involved in the oil industry and is assisting South Sudan in infrastructure development projects that will allow India to take full advantage of the oil there. However, India's stance for development is is more likely to lead to economic diversity and a more stable region. Another major issue for the region is the influence of non-governmental organizations. Many of them have difficulty operating in Sudan and South Sudan, even though there is a great need there because of the security situation. By operating there, at times they provide subnational groups, armed groups, a chance to collect supplies and hostages to further their own negative gains. NGOs have also had difficulty with creating long-term development programs because of the security environment, and in the 70s, 80s, and 90s drove many Western companies out of the oil industry in Sudan due to Sudan's human rights abuses. This had good and bad impacts on the nation because at the time the United States and Western countries could influence their oil industry to provide more ethical service in that country. But now that China and India are the primary drivers in the energy sector there, and neither country has as strong a commitment or has expressed a stronger commitment to human rights as the United States and other Western nations, the influence on multinational corporations in the country is lessened in terms of creating humanitarian positives for humanitarian aid. Multinational corporations, as we've been discussing, do have a major impact in the country. The extractive industries can fund violence by allowing armed groups to collect illegal tolls and tariffs on the transport and access to oil, or they can be part of the solution. Before leaving the sector, there were several European countries that chose to be part of the solution and helped to negotiate an end to conflict between various groups by helping to broker revenue sharing agreements. And as I said before, now the companies that are there are primarily owned by China and India and do not have the commitment to human rights that some Western companies did have. Other players in the nation are regional and international organizations, such as the UN and the AU. The AU has put troops on the ground in Darfur and in Somalia, so they are committed to stopping human rights abuses. However, they are poorly funded, and in Sudan and South Sudan have primarily taken a mediation role in helping to curb state-to-state violence, and could potentially be used to assist in mediating some of the intertribal violence and reconciling some of the separatist groups into the political process. The UN has peacekeepers at the border now. However, they do not have access to the Sudan and are only operating in South Sudan. The UN has the advantage of greater international backing and funding for its troops, so it will continue to be an influence for some time to come as peacekeeping is necessary at the border. Subnational violence does have the potential to erupt into state-to-state hostility, but there are some solutions to the problem. The perhaps most difficult and most likely to have the greatest impact would be to limit the small arms proliferation in the region. ECOWAS is another regional body in East Africa. They have put in place several regional arms control treaties in Eastern Africa, and the AU could potentially utilize the same template to put small arms control into effect in Northeastern Africa. Border protection would also assist with small arms proliferation in the region as well. The United States has already made partnerships with other African nations through the Department of Homeland Security to train border patrol agents in other nations. China has not been able or has not shown an interest in training security forces in other countries, but could certainly provide funding for such groups to do so because it is in their best interest to have secure access to the oil in that region. And India has also trained security forces in other countries and has an interest in maintaining a secure source of oil. So those types of programs could certainly assist in limiting the flow of armed groups and arms in and out of the country. In terms of long-term development, it is critical that civil society be rebuilt in Sudan and in South Sudan through education programs and good governance type programs. An integration of tribal elders is also extraordinarily important, and key to that is sharing the revenue from the oil fields from the land that the tribes currently occupy. They must be included in the political process so that they can feel that they have a share in the benefit of the oil and be allowed to have a certain amount of autonomy to reinstate tribal conflict resolution mechanisms that have maintained the peace at the border throughout history and have only recently become so perversely violent. While there are many problems to overcome, it's clear that the solution will not be reached without coordinated effort between long-term development programs and small arms counter-proliferation activities. Without a coordinated approach, we will continue to face an unstable Sudan and South Sudan and the potential for additional international intervention. Thank you.